SLEs, and the worksheets that I've all handed you go in chronological order with our presentation. So at the end of our presentation, we'll just go over the answers so everyone gets an idea of what our section was actually about.
Good afternoon, my name is Daniel Ho, and the very first question I'm going to answer for you. We're going to be talking about Section 4 of CLB 102, and our section is called the Convict Stain, and we'll be talking about the convicts in Australia. So I'm going to lead it over to Janessa to take over and start the presentation.
Living in Botany Bay was similar to living in hell on earth, as was described by historian Manning Clark. Clark argued that among the early people to settle in Australia were a convict population of a depraved criminal class. This statement was made famous from 1792 engraving Black-Eyed Sue and Sweet Paul Plymouth, taking leave of their lovers were going to Botany Bay. Finding out exactly what type of criminals came to Australia is a bit challenging in itself. The best source for a broad classification of the types of convicts is the Indents of Convict Ships, which gave information on the age, religion, nature of the offence, place of trial, occupation, sex, and previous criminal record of the convict. From the Indents of Convict Ships, the majority of convicts were transported for thefts. Another finding from the Indents of Convict Ships is the convicts were drawn almost entirely from the working class. Now digging deeper in finding information about the convicts, we look at the gender ratios of the convict population. Between 1797 and April 1815, approximately 5,500 males and 1,800 females were transported from Great Britain, a ratio of 3 to 1. The poor men suffered a pretty bad ratio if you ask me, but it only gets better in the future when reforms to a criminal law occur between 1824 and 1832. The idea was that transportation was too harsh a punishment for women. Because of the reform, the number of women transported was significantly reduced. Approximately 55,000 males and 7,800 females were transported from Great Britain between 1817 through to 1834, a ratio of 7 to 1. A quick survey of the Indents of Convicts revealed that most convicts were from the skilled towns of Ireland. Most of them were workers, the unskilled outnumbering the skilled, and most of them were transported for theft. More findings from the Indents of Convicts revealed that there was a low percentage of agricultural labourers and a high percentage of town workers. At first glance, you would think that the convicts who were transported into Australia would prove to be an effective labour pool for any European society, but Clark deducted other reasonings. Among the convicts were domestic servants, skilled labour for the towns, labourers for construction of roads and public buildings, and finally, agricultural labourers for the development of the primary industries. No convict came with a lack of skill in a certain trade or profession, but this harmony of interest is deceptive. A new colony required a man of resource, versatile yet, or better yet, a jack of all trades. The majority of convicts came from towns where the decision of labour was so advanced that they were forced to learn a narrow specialisation for which there would be little need in a colony society. To make matters worse, housewives were not enthusiastic in allowing domestic servants to work for them because of the influence on both their children and their spouses. Keeping in mind, the Indents of the Convicts doesn't reveal the true facts we wanted to know. Were there more petty thieves than professionals? And what were the convicts like as far as their appearance, behaviour and values? Two sources, both of which credibility can be questioned, do help in answering our dying curiosity about the Australian convicts. One being the criminal record in the official reports of the persons sentenced to transportation, and the second being the informed opinion in Great Britain. The criminal returns to the British House of Commons is not very helpful because of the uncertainty whether people sentenced to transportation in Australia actually went, and any previous criminal record of a person's before the years 1826 was totally non-existent. A sample of the convicts after 1826 shows that, on average, 1/4 to 1/3 were second offenders. The second source, which was the informed opinion in Great Britain, reveals that criminals are one section of the working class, What this means is that it was considered an occupation to be a criminal just as it was a plumber or a carpenter. The informed opinion also reveals that the opinions differ on the cause of their criminal behaviour, from the unwillingness to work because of the unfavourable environment that Australia had compared to England, but all agree in classifying criminals as a working class group, while the references to casual crimes against property are so rare that one could possibly infer the fate that such behaviour was common. Patrick Colquhoun in 1788 to 1800 of London describes how he was a sharp and sympathetic observer of the conditions in London at the turn of the century. But he doesn't mention the casuals in his list of thieves. The class of thieves in London, he tells us, was composed of young men abandoning business or being bred to no profession and having been reduced by this idleness to indulge in gambling and scenes of debauchery and dissipation. Impoverished and unable to buy their gratifications, they have taken to the life of crime to supply their immediate wants. Our opinion, deducted from the findings of Manning Clark on the convicts, is that a universal classification of what defines a criminal, lacking and incorrect reasonings from minor offences, were punished with the transportation to Australia.
If the picture painted by Manning Clark and other male Australian convicts was bad, how women convicts were portrayed was worse. Women were regularly damned by colonial authorities and other moral leaders, including the notorious Samuel Marsden, who in 1806 produced a survey of all women in the colony, classifying them either as moral women or as concubines. By the 1960s and the 1970s, feminist historians Ann Summers and Marian Dixon began to challenge the biasnesses of generations of scholars and commentators. However, they didn't challenge the image of a woman convict as a whore, but rather that the fate of many women was imposed on them by an apex male power structure. The social and economic conditions of the first 50 years of white colonization of Australia fostered whores rather than spouses. The first 2 decades of colonization mainly consisted of transported convicts. The classification that all women were whores was applied to all female convicts. There was little chance of redefining the stereotype. Worse yet, the stereotype was applied to women who weren't even transported into Australia. The first fleet consisted of approximately 1,500 people. More than half of those were convicts. Governor Arthur Phillip hoped he was to be the first superintendent of this new outpost of British civilization. He wanted free settlers to be encouraged to migrate to the outpost, and he wrote, "As I would not wish convicts to lay foundations of an empire." The British Home Office had other ideas, however, and intended New South Wales to be little more than a dumping ground for the excess of convicts which the British jails could not accommodate. Women in the colonies were assigned only one main function: objects of sexual seduction / gratification for the men. Women who arrived on the first fleet were slotted into one of 3 classes. Women in the first class were eligible for assignment and to marry. The second held women who had been sentenced for minor crimes, and after a period of probation, they could join the women in the first class. The third class consisted of women who had been transported for a second-time offense or had been found guilty of misconduct during the voyage or after their arrival. Women convicts aboard the first fleet were kept on board for 5 days while the other ships unloaded and shelters were built for women. Governor Phillip, well, he turned a blind eye and to the vile 2 days of sinning that ensued upon the woman. The revelry, Governor Phillip's blind eye to the woman, was a signal, the kind of treatment which was to be of the female convicts. A difficulty as far as the British authorities were concerned was finding a steady supply of women to transport. A rather unfair solution was initiated in that authorities began to impose harsher sentences on the women. Remember when Janessa noted that all convicts were sentenced to transportation? Well, and they actually didn't go? Well, that mainly applied to men, whereas for women, as long as you were healthy and you were under the age of 45, you were transported. Women were forced to work hard on near starvation rations in the first few years, and they were brutally punished for even minor transgressions. For at least the first 20 years, women had no means of escaping this fate. The best a woman could do was to form an attachment with one man and live with him as his wife. The woman could protect herself from the unwelcome attention of any other man who fancied her. Whether a woman was a concubine to one man or available to all, she was still considered a whore. Female convicts were universally condemned. Thomas McQueen, a magistrate and a former convict himself, described the women he sentenced as the most disgusting objects of the female form. Governor Darling wrote in 1830 that the women he sent out to Australia were of the very worst, and all hope was lost in the Reformation back at home. Another man by the name of Lachlan Macquarie also condemned women, but he advocated for more male convicts to be sent, since the prosperity of the colony depended on labor being available for public works and agriculture. He considered that female convicts served a great drawback, whereas others are beneficial. In 1821, this marked the opening of a female factory in Parramatta. It was a 3-story building designed to accommodate 300 women. It served as both a prison and a place of employment. Female factories would appear to resemble conventional imprisonment, but that was not the case. These factories continued to justify how women were all perceived as whores. The factories may have allowed women to avoid degradation of convicts, but systematic abuse took place over physical abuse in the factories. The factory at Parramatta functioned both as a brothel and as a marriage mart. James Mudie said more women were retained in the first class than was necessary to serve the size of the establishment. He recounted that matron, Miss Gordon, refused several times to allow him to take home with him the servants that he chose. Miss Gordon unofficially employed the woman herself, and she made thousands of pounds through her enterprise. Any convict or free settler could go to this prison and choose a spouse. And now we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to show you a video that we have demonstrating this process.
The eligible women are turned out, and they all stand up as you would place so many soldiers or so many cattle. In fact, they are all ranked up. The convict goes up and looks at the woman. If he sees a lady that takes his fancy, he makes a motion to her, and she steps to one side. Some will not, but stand still, but that is very rare. The two have, of course, some conversation together, and if the lady is not agreeable, or if the convict does not fancy her from her conversation, she steps back, and the same ceremony goes on with 2 or 3 more.
Conditions on women was universally despised. In 1841, Lady Jane Franklin tried to form a ladies' committee to visit the women in the Cascades factory. When the proposed committee was announced to the press, it was mercilessly ridiculed, and the press attacks were so fierce that the committee disbanded, much to Lady Jane's dismay. Transportation to Australia ceased in 1852, and by that time the damned whore stereotype wasn't as dominant as it used to be, but it still persisted. Good news is that in reality females were not as evil and depraved as they were painted. It needed to be pointed out that what was considered a crime then would be considered a misdemeanor today. By far, the most common crimes committed by these women were larceny and the theft of wearing apparel. The whore stereotype was devised as a calculated sexist means of social control. It was deemed necessary by both the local and free British authorities to have supply of whores to keep the men, both convict and free, behaved.
So just remember that this is just an overview of our chapter, as you were all supposed to have read it before tutorials.
Yes, I have.
That we've just chosen the main ideas, the topics discussed in the section that we felt was most important for you guys to hear. The European invasion of Australia was very different by the standards of the time. Typically, the British Empire expanded through military conquest. Colonies were exchanged as the spoils of war, or through formal empire building in the wake of the informal penetration. Treaties were signed and protectorates established. When Britain took Australia, it was in an entirely new way. No treaties were signed with the Indigenous peoples, no rival imperial powers hung. Judges, not generals, decided who came. Convicted criminals, not economic or religious entrepreneurs, were the troops of invasion. Unaddressed guilt surrounded conquest. Mixed with the criminal identity of the first white population, created what became known of our section, the Convict Stain. The reasoning to this is that people wanted to deny the past and wanted to rid of the nation's origins as it needed to be cleansed. Australia's convict past. The past connections was largely ignored and hidden through the development of colonies. It wasn't until an English gentleman by the name of George Arnold Wood that Australia's murky past was really assessed. Wood, through his findings, which aren't detailed, wrote that convicts were more sinned against than sinning. Less criminal than the blustering ruffians on the bench, Wood said that convicts were good people who lived in difficult times. So began the debate among historians regarding convicts of the past century.
The reputation of Australia's convicts was reviewed in the 1980s. Convicts weren't as bad as they were made out to be, and women weren't the raging whores as Summers detailed. Convicts were now innocent village Hamptons who had been convicted for stealing a loaf of bread, which they hoped to feed their starving families. The idea was not a new one. As early as the 1920s, historian George Arnold Wood argued that Australia's convicts, far from being professional class, were rather victims of an immoral social inequality of an unjust legal system. David Roberts traces the origins of Wood's important thesis and the controversy it provoked. Woods was a pioneer of the popular view that convicts were more sinned against than sinning. His sentiments were in tune with a radical tradition of opposition to economic exploitation, social influence, and moral corruption. He did agree that people who were sent over to Australia did indeed break a law of some sort. The main point of Wood's thesis was that the convicts were the ultimate winners. Being hardworking people, by his account, they flourished and improved themselves in this healthier and fairer environment than back at home compared to those colonies. Their descendants, robust and industrious, from the start, founded one of the world's most egalitarian and democratic societies. Woods held a philosophy that people who possessed an inner goodness will shine brightly through adversity. The notion wasn't contrived by Woods himself, but stems from the idea of Marion Phillips. Phillips says that New South Wales led to a rehabilitation and a new environment for those who had fallen out of the social struggle.
So for the conclusion, this is our take from the reading, which is not necessarily the conclusion to our section, the Convict Stain. Clark argued that convicts were members of a professional criminal class and draws upon the informed opinion of the 18th and 19th century, which associated theft with the criminal class from a temptation for property obtained without enduring the hardships of labour.
Clark is able to present a more accurate picture of the typical convicts by using larger samples of convicts and looking into their backgrounds. Clark incorporates more hard evidence than Wood's notion of convicts being more sinned against than sinning, because Wood ignores crucial facts in favor of upholding the nationalist opinion.
Deborah Oxley laid to rest the myth of convicts being a criminal class by examining the skills and occupational backgrounds of approximately 19,700 convicts from the ships arriving from 1870 to 1840. Oxley examined every woman who was transported from 1826 to 1840 also.
Thank you.
Did you do the answers when we were going through? So did you want to answer some?
Me?
Yeah.
Name of the chapter was The Convict Stain.
Anyone has number 2? Answer number 2?
I want to know.
Cool. the name of the information that held all of the convicts' details?
It's the indents of the convict ships.
Awesome. And what about number 4? Anyone?
There's a low percentage of agricultural workers, and so there were too many town workers and not enough towns.
Okay, fantastic. And was the true or false? Number 5, sorry. What were they mainly for? What were they mainly transported out for?
Okay.
Cool. And the true or false question.
It was true.
Cool. And number 7?
C.
Or all of the above.
Oh, I didn't see that one.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
all of the
Across
above.
that.
So all of the above. Number 8. So what was the percentage rate?
D.
Yeah, more than one half. Yeah. Number 9. Fantastic. That's great. Number 10. What was the factory?
A prison or place of employment.
Yeah, that's great. And number 11. On the other page, yeah.
True.
Cool. And number 12, was it A or C or B and D?
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. And number 13.
There were no treaties, there were convicts, not entrepreneurs, so it was like civilians invading rather than the military.
Cool. And we just had a question down the bottom, which was number 14, so that you could put, towards the teacher, but we're out of time, so. I'll take that as I think that's a good thing. Be a bit different.
Well, I don't know if you asked me, but I have asked, but people sometimes ask, what do I do? I said, make a difference.
Yeah, so that's what we thought we would
I didn't
do.
say it.
Instead of the, yeah, you did.
Because it's very easy to get into the reason